All right, so here we have section 4.7 where, oops, hold on a second. All right, so we have section 4.7, which is going to deal with using congruent triangles, and we're going to start off with CPCTC, which stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, now this is going to make a lot of sense. Basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be proving that if we have two congruent triangles, then any corresponding segments will be congruent to each other and any corresponding angles will be congruent to each other. So we're going to be using proofs. We have to go in and prove triangles are congruent, then take facts about those triangles that we don't already know and then say they're congruent to each other. But we'll get to that in a second. The reason this makes sense, though, is going to be because you kind of have to think about what it means for two figures to be congruent to each other. Think back to the beginning of the chapter, okay, and take a second, see if you can figure out what it means for two figures to be congruent. All right, so hopefully you figured it out, but in order for two figures to be congruent, everything has to be congruent. All of my corresponding angles have to be congruent, and all my corresponding segments have to be congruent. So if we have congruent triangles, all my corresponding parts, of course, have to be congruent. So that's why we say corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. All right, this is my good old CPCTC. So in order to use it in a proof, we're going to follow these steps. First, we're only going to use this when we're proving either segments or angles are congruent. So just remember that, segments and angles only. We will never, 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 ever use CPCTC in order to prove triangles are congruent, because we need congruent triangles first, so it just doesn't even make sense. So in order to use this theorem, we have to first prove that our two triangles are congruent. This is going to be by our side angle side, side side side, angle side angle, or angle side, or hypotenuse leg. Once we have said somewhere in our proof that our triangles are congruent, then we can go in and we can say, since my triangles are congruent, all of my corresponding segments or angles are going to be congruent. So this is how we'll do in a proof. Follow with me on this one and copy it down as we go, and then the next one you're going to try on your own. All right, so here's something that we're given. We're going to be given that SV is congruent to TU and ST is congruent to VU. Okay, and we want to prove that angle S is going to be congruent to, this is supposed to be angle U. All right, so let's change this back. So we're going to prove that angle S is congruent to angle U. In order to do that, I first have to look at what triangles are these angles in. So we're going to first want to prove that angle STU is congruent to angle UVT. Okay, so let's make a checklist. Our checklist is going to be kind of like an outline in a proof. So we make outlines in order to keep our papers flowing well in English, so we're going to make an outline for a proof. It should help you out. I mean, I'm not going to count off if you don't do this on a test, but it will really help you out, I promise. So our first thing that we want to prove is, in order to show that our angles are congruent, we're first going to have to show that our triangles are congruent. So when we have a proof, the first thing we're always going to do is write down everything in our diagram. So here I know SV is congruent to TU and ST is congruent to VU. Okay, so try and fill out this checklist right here, and then we'll see if you got it right. So what we have is we have SV is congruent to TU, and that's going to be given to us, of course. ST is congruent to VU, and that's given, of course. And then we have our third side. Okay, VT is going to be congruent to itself, and we're going to use that because it's in both triangles. All right. Now we don't have these angles yet. That's what we're getting to. So let's erase those really quick. All right. Once we have said all this, it's pretty obvious that we have a side, and a side. So we're going to prove that triangle STV is congruent to triangle UVT by our side, side theorem. Okay, hopefully you've kind of gotten that from the past couple of lessons. Then all we have to do is say, since triangle STV is congruent to triangle UVT, we can see that it's obvious that angle S and angle U are corresponding, since they're in the same spots of our congruent statement. So then I can say that angle S is congruent to angle U by my CPCTC theorem. Okay, that's all we got to do. So let's try and put it in a proof. So here we have our proof, of course. This is just going to be the start, and I'm just going to write our checklist here because you should have your given already written down. All right. So my given, of course, is going to be that SV is congruent to TU and ST is congruent to VU. So you can go ahead and write that down. And that's, of course, just going to be because of my given. Then we can go in, and by our checklist, we can say that our segment TV is congruent to segment TV. And that's, of course, going to be because of my reflexive property of segment congruence, because one segment will always be congruent to itself. Then after that, looking at our checklist, all we want to do is we want to prove that triangle STV is congruent to triangle UTV by our side, side theorem. So we can come up here and check that off. Then we want to go down, and now we want to do what our proof was saying. So we want to go in, and we want to say, since S is in the same spot as U, I know these angles are corresponding. They're corresponding angles of my triangle. They're the same angle. So then I know they're congruent because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are always congruent. So I'm, of course, going to use my CPCTC theorem. Okay, if you have any questions, please raise your hand at this point and let me know. If not, we're going to start a new proof, and you're going to try this one all on your own. So here I have my new point, or my new proof, and all we know is that P is going to be the midpoint of RS, and it's going to be the midpoint of QT. So think to yourself, what does it mean to be a midpoint? Hopefully you already know. All right, if not, look it up in your book, or ask your neighbor, or look it up in your notes or something, okay? So when we write our checklist, we're first, of course, going to have to prove that our triangles are congruent, because the whole reason we're proving this is because I want Q to be congruent to T. So I got to go, and I figured out that QPR is going to be a triangle that's congruent to SPT. All right, so that's why I want to prove that QRP is congruent to TSP. So I can go in and take apart their parts and then say my corresponding parts are congruent. So when you're filling in your checklist, it's obvious that when we have a midpoint, it's dividing our segments into two smaller congruent segments. So QP and PT are going to be congruent, and RP and PS are going to be congruent. Then we know we can't have an angle side theorem because that spells something bad, so we know we're going to have a side angle side since there's nothing that we can prove about QR and ST. So I know I'm not going to use side, so I'm left with side angle side. So we're going to go in and look at QPR and SPT, and we're going to say since those are vertical angles, I know they're congruent by my vertical angle congruence theorem. After that, of course, like we said before, we can prove that QRP and TSP are congruent by my side angle side congruence theorem. After that, I can tell that Q and T are in the same spot of my congruent statement, so they're going to have to be corresponding parts. So I know my angles are congruent by my corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruence theorem. Okay, so now you should be able to fill in this proof. So pause the video and then see if you can fill it in on your own. Check yourself afterwards. Okay, so when we have our statements and reasons, the first thing we're always going to write is going to be our given. The only thing we're given here is that P is the midpoint of TQ and RS. So then after that, and what I did is I put them in the same one because they're using the same reason, but I went in here and said that QP is congruent to PT and RP is congruent to PS because of my definition of a midpoint. Okay, so in our checklist, we took the fact that P is a midpoint of TQ, wrote our congruent statement here, and then we said P is the midpoint of RS and wrote our statement there. Okay, again, I can write them together since it's the same reason, and they're not; these two are not relying on each other in a certain order. So once I've said that QRP and triangle TPS are congruent, I can show that angle Q and angle T are in corresponding parts of my triangles that are already congruent. So I can come down here and I can say that angle Q and angle T are corresponding congruent because they are corresponding parts of congruent triangles.